Hello, and welcome to the Dissonance Podcast, where we talk about how we can strive for a world in which freedom and reason are at the forefront of all human society. In this week's podcast, Elizabeth is joined by the founders of 1776 Forward for a conversation about the importance of free speech as a mechanism for thinking, learning, and reflection. Hello, and welcome back to the Dissonance Podcast. Today, usually it's Mike that introduces the Dissonance Podcast, so it's a new voice today. It's just Elizabeth today with two guests. We have Chris Bush and Joia. I just lost your last name. It just flew out of my memory. What's your last name, Joia? So I'm going to actually let you both introduce yourselves a little more thoroughly. But Joia sent me an article called Private Thought and Public Speech by David Bromwich. And so we're going to sort of center our discussion loosely on that article, because that's what we tend to do here at the Dissonance. And it is in an opinion piece in, what's it in?
Compact Magazine.
Compact Magazine. Okay. So we're going to talk about that article today, and I'm going to let each of you introduce yourselves, and your podcast and your affiliation with ILV. So, Chris, do you want to start? Is that okay?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Elizabeth, and thanks for having us. So I'm Chris Bush, for all of you listening. I am a co-founder with Joia of an organization called 1776 Forward, which is devoted to sparking a cultural, philosophical, political revolution for philosophical liberalism, which is a philosophy of freedom and flourishing. And our connection with Elizabeth and ILV is that we just recently launched a podcast in partnership with ILV called Free Speech Forward, which is a unique kind of brief format, 5-question interview, kind of rapid fire interview with free speech activists, really telling the behind the scenes story of kind of their personal why and how they came to fighting for free speech. Free speech is one of, in our view, one of the two core pillars of a free society and philosophical liberalism, because it really encompasses not only speech, but kind of the broader range of freedom to think, believe, and express yourself. And the other one being free markets, which is to create and trade. So Free Speech Forward is our way of kind of really emphasizing the value of free speech. And we just launched that in partnership with ILV. I'll turn it over to my co-host, Joia.
Oh. Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Elizabeth. It's actually Joia Houheneka, which I know it's not even an easy name to pronounce. And Chris did a wonderful job, I think, of introducing who we are, our organization, why we're here. And we're just delighted to have this opportunity to discuss this article. I think it's going to make a great jumping off point to think about issues of free speech. And something that Chris and I are definitely both interested in, which is beyond just the politics and the legal aspects of free speech, to think about a culture of free speech and why a culture of free speech is so important. And I read this article and thought it just had some really interesting observations for why free speech matters.
Yeah, well, that was what the first thing I was going to ask you, because you chose the article. I'm always choosing articles that are now I was going to say that have psychological, psychology. They tend to be more experimental and psychological. But I would argue this article has quite a bit of psychology in it. Not because the author knows anything about psychology, as the author does not, but it's in there. So I have my own comments, but I'd be interested in hearing a little bit more about why you chose this article.
Well, that is one of the interesting things we observed. I'll say I think I was particularly enamored with this article because my background is in English, and the author of this speech is an English professor from Yale, and certainly his background is in poetry and rhetoric, and all those things speak to me. I started out my career as a PhD candidate in English. But both Chris and I did notice that there were a lot of psychological ideas, and we thought, these will be great things that we can talk to Elizabeth about. So we even have that on the back of our mind to want to hear what you think about some of the psychological ideas that he floats. And I'll jump in and say this is one of the reasons why I like this particular article. So if I was going to sum up what I took from this article, that it was all about what I like to call thinking aloud in public and the necessity of experiment when you are thinking aloud in public, and why that's so important for a flourishing life, for a flourishing society. And in my opinion, I thought the article itself was an example of thinking aloud in public. I didn't think that he necessarily presented a full-fledged argument or case for the points that he was making, but he was doing exactly what he was advocating, which is putting forth some ideas into the public sphere, hopefully with the idea of getting feedback. So I would also even hope that maybe he would somehow find this podcast and hear what we have to say about it, and maybe even come up with some revised thoughts on what he shared in this particular article.
Yeah, so Chris, did you fall in love with this article also?
Well, I had mixed reactions, kind of in line with Joia. So on the one hand, I actually really loved the psychological aspect of it. I kind of use the same phrase, thinking aloud. Joia kind of addended onto it the in public part, which I think is a key part of his thesis. But I never thought about my own thinking process in that way. But it resonated immediately. It seemed immediately perceptible and self-evident that is part of the process. So I think both from a psychological and an epistemological perspective of like, how do we really know what we think in our heads, and doing that aloud, I found intellectually very interesting and fascinating topic to chew on. But at the same time, I also share with Joia a sense that, I thought particularly he says at the outset that his goal is to kind of make the case for the traditional civil libertarian view against censorship. And I didn't really feel like he developed that sufficiently, at least for my own taste.
I agree. He said that's what he was going to do, and he never got there really with the censorship.
Right. I mean, we can certainly break it down. There are ways in which he got there kind of subtly and indirectly towards the end, but I felt there was a lot more territory he could have covered. But that said, I guess to add on to what Joia said, what really resonated to me, I guess, is that psychological aspect, and in particular, the experimental, the way he described thinking aloud in public as an experimental process, I think is key, because I think inherent in even the concept of experiment is you don't know all the answers and you're trialing and erroring. And I think that it's a really important reframing of how to think about speaking and thinking in our current era, because so much of the cultural discourse and public discourse, especially across all domains, not just on politics or in academia, but in the business world or otherwise, have been so narrowly prescribed, and there's so many rules and restrictions on what you can and can't say, that I think I do agree with his description of kind of the banality and almost kind of superfluousness of public dialogue today for that reason. So to me, that was a really core element. And I know just even from my own personal experience coming from the corporate world, that really resonated, because I see the application even on non-political topics.
Yeah. So again, the title is Private Thought and Public Speech. And so the argument, he's making several, but that he's saying that he says the past decade has witnessed a notable rise in the deployment of outrageous speech. And he says by outrageous, I don't mean angry, indignant, or accusational. So he's saying it is speech that outrageous speech means only to enrage and not to convey any information or argument. So he's saying outrageous speech is, so he really starts out the paragraph with outrageous speech, but he's saying that's not what I want to talk about, right? Mm-hmm. He's saying I don't want to talk about speech that is just to enrage or get people riled up. I want to talk about he's saying I want to talk about speech that is, as you say, generative of ideas and thoughts, and and sharing of ideas, and sort of, again, Joia, I have a master's in English also, and the first time I ever heard the quote that he lists in here, is it Yeats? E.M. Forster. How do I know what I think until I hear myself say it, right? That a version of that. And so that I would argue is more the thesis of this piece. How do I know what I think until I hear myself say it? I need to, to speak out loud, and I need to share with others my thoughts and let them help me refine them, is kind of what he's saying. We need free speech because we need others' help. This is a, what is it? What was it? Was it President? Was it Michelle Obama? This is a, sort of like, this is a, raising kids is like a, it's really a community project. And he's sort of saying like, public discourse is the natural course of the way that we communicate. It's a community project to navigate our lives, and we need others' help. And how would we get others' help except through the ability to share incomplete thoughts? And there's a whole one of the ways that I actually, I mentioned the master's in English because that's a way that I sort of backed into parts of psychology and who I ended up working with. There is a whole theory, a whole field of psychology that's narrative psychology. And there are plenty of researchers who would argue that all thought is in narrative form. And that's where I disagree with some of the art. The author says something at some point here. The author of this suggests that, I'm going to try to find it here, that thoughts at a form, so private thoughts, he says, private thoughts begin as something pre-verbal. And there's certainly a large body of literature that, again, we don't know because we don't know what's going on, but certainly there are many researchers who would argue that there is no thought without language. And if there were thought without language, we simply would not be able to access those thoughts because we have evolved to be so dependent on language, which I do think, again, is what this author is arguing, is that we're so dependent on language that we need free speech because we need language to think. So I would disagree a little bit. So he says, because he says thoughts at this formative stage can never be supposed identical with whatever finds its way to expression. I do agree that let's think about that for a second. Do either one of you think there's a difference between what you think or what you feel, maybe even, your feelings? Does language change, just not even having a conversation with anybody, putting something into words, does that change for you your emotions, your physiological, your physical experiences, and as well as your attitudes, thoughts, behaviors? So, what would you have to say about that?
I'll jump in on this one because I'm going to agree that language is so important. As I mentioned, my background was in English, but that said, I do see thought extending beyond just words. And I'm going to be really interested to hear what Chris says because his background is partly in architecture. So perhaps how he thinks in perhaps a more visual or spatial term. So I'm going to be really curious what he has to say. I would challenge
you to prove that because you can't prove it without language.
Well, but I'm going to jump in here and say, before I pass it to Chris, I want to say that even though I would recognize that even just in my own internal experience of my own inner world, that there are definitely experiences that I have that are on a more sensory level, and you could perhaps expand the definition of thought to include those. But the distinction I would make is that there's thinking on the conceptual level, and thinking in the conceptual level requires language or at least symbols. I think mathematical symbols arise to a level that perhaps we could also call language, although it's obviously not language the way that English or French are
computer
languages.
Programming lines, that's a language.
Right. So perhaps with a broader conception of language, that there is no thought, and I would say there's certainly no conceptual thought without language. That said, just my own experience of being a thinker and a writer, I've internally found the truth of what he says, and what poets have alluded to, as he points out, that you don't really know what you think until you try to write. And honestly, this is personally what motivated me even when I was in English, like why I thought English was so important. A huge part of what I had to do was to grade students on their writing. And to me, the importance of that was I would always make the point that thinking is writing. Writing is thinking, that you don't know what you actually think until you try to write it out. My own experience of trying to write something or trying to speak even like this is in the back of my head, there's always this voice saying, well, what exactly am I trying to say here? And it's in the process of trying to put something into words and then putting the words together into a sentence and then linking that sentence with another sentence into paragraphs, into an argument, that I actually find out what it is that I think about something. Chris and I even went through an interesting example of this. We wrote up our statement recently on philosophical liberalism, and these were ideas that we'd been floating around literally for years, but when we actually had to stop and say, well, what exactly do we mean by philosophical liberalism? And it just produced so much more thinking and results as we went through the process of trying to write it out. And because I believe so strongly in that, I think this is why the message of this article resonated with me, because I see the value of having a cultural space for thinking aloud in public where experimentation is allowed. And it reminds me, I'm just going to bring this back. So we just wrapped up recording an interview with Elizabeth that you can find on our podcast, which is Free Speech Forward. And you had made an observation, which I think is spot on, that people get invested in what they say publicly. And once they've said something publicly, they don't want to take it back. And I think that's because we have a culture that has made that okay, where something that you said on the internet 20 years ago can be found and used against you. Where I think what we would rather create is a culture that recognizes that human beings are not omniscient. We have to make mistakes. Life is a continuous journey of learning. And we should be able to speak ideas publicly, put ideas out there that are just in experimental form, precisely so that we can get feedback and learn and grow and make them better. And that if we can create a culture that recognizes that, then everybody wins.
Well, that's what when you were talking, I was thinking now, do we really, I do want to get your answer to that question, Chris, by the way. But do we really figure out what we think by talking or writing, or do we come to a story? Because again, if we think about our whole lives are a story, right? We have cultural stories, we have family stories, we have our own story arc in our lives. So by putting language to something, do we really learn what we think, or are we coming to a story that fits within the arc of our lives, within the culture that we exist in, within our current environment, within our family, and that kind of thing? And so are we discovering some true value of something, or are we creating value by writing and stuff? And I think, Joia, that gets back to, I don't think we know the answer to that question. I'm not saying that you should, but that gets back to this idea of please don't go back even to yesterday and hold against me something that I said. Instead, let's use it, because I'm still writing the story of my life, right? You're still writing the story of your life. The society is still writing the story of our lives. And if we so narrowly say, if we're so attached to something that we write or something that we say, that we can't take revision or edits or what, I mean, if we just think back to like student papers or whatever, if we become so attached to it that we're not willing to rethink it or rejigger it, then we're also the problem, right? Because so it's both ways. It's people using it against us, and it's also us refusing to give. Yeah. So anyway, Chris, do you think that using language changes your again, your emotions, your experience of things? Do you think once you put something into language, it is inexorably altered?
Yeah, no, that is a fascinating question. I think the answer is yes. I mean, as you know, language is, and as I think the author rightly points out, language is inherently both defining, enabling, but also confining and narrowing conceptually what it is you're trying to say. And I do know from direct experience, in fact, even just yesterday, I was taking a walk and talking with my husband, and I had this thought based on our conversation that I wanted to get out, but it was trying to integrate a bunch of different ideas, and I really didn't know what I wanted to say. And having the benefit of this article now in my mind, I was kind of observing, even kind of real time, how the process played out. But I definitely felt frustrated by the limitations of language, and then even as I tried to use words to articulate what I was thinking, I felt that they weren't quite adequate. Now, maybe that's partly I just need a broader vocabulary, but I think it's pretty good already.
Yeah.
So I think, I guess using that as just one personal example, I would answer your question by saying, yes, I do think language narrows, but then I also, using that same example, I think I would probably tend to agree with Joy as well, that there clearly was something sensory or in me that kind of was even in the moment it felt pre-conceptual. And so I think the experience, if anything, highlights to me how we are sometimes limited in expressing what it is we think by the words we have available, either in our own lexicon or just in the dictionary in general.
And I suspect that while you were having that conversation, you were saying things like, I apologize if this isn't making any sense.
Yeah.
Right? You probably said some things like that, like, help. And you, again, this is there is no story. Again, I'm using psychological theory. So, psychologists would say that really we don't have any of our own stories. All of our stories are built through the community in some way, that we don't own our stories. And so we really, again, I think this relates to free speech and to, because if we think of our speech as a product of and a gift to the community, then maybe we would be a little less censorious and a little more forgiving, because as you did with your partner, can we envision a society where we do that in more rich ways and accept that, not just in a classroom when people are reminded that they must do it, and not just in a relationship where you feel either free to do it or like, oh, geez, I have to resolve this, conflict or something.
Right.
But just as a habit of being.
Yeah. And casual interactions with people across the spectrum of your relationships. Yeah.
To let go, to let go of this idea that, this story that I'm telling, whether it's a socio-political kind of story or something else, to let go of the idea that it belongs only to myself. If we could go out into the world and sort of accept that our stories are generative and of the larger community, maybe we would be a little more we would be more free with our speech, and maybe others would be more forgiving. Mm-hmm. So I had this idea of like, is there thought without language? And I think both of you kind of. What do you think about artificial intelligence? What do you think this author? What would you have to say about it? And what do you think this author would have to say about artificial intelligence? I mean, he just didn't even mention it.
Mhm.
Can I just jump in and say, because I cannot let pass something that you said that I really want to comment on, because you talked about how, in a sense, none of the stories are ours, and that these are stories that have already existed and they're part of the culture. And on one hand, I agree with that, but when I hear that, always love to make the opposite argument as well. And I think there's important senses in which both are true. So, for example, I'm a mother. Like, if you're listening to this call, you might hear a baby screaming in the background, because that's me trying to do double duty of being a mom and having a career. And motherhood is perhaps the oldest story of humanity. It's how human beings got here. So, in a sense, I'm telling a story that's just part of perhaps the oldest story of humanity. But yet, what I find, even just from talking to other mothers, is that every mother's story is different, and
Of
every mother's
course.
story becomes your own. So I think there is a beautiful
Yes.
way in which, in recognizing, even if the stories have been told before, every story is itself unique. And to me, that's even part of this value of free speech, is getting all the unique stories out there. The way in which they're common is the way in which we ought to share them, because they help us to inform our sense of ourselves and our journeys. But the fact that they are all so different and all so unique is part of why we should be sharing them all.
So yeah, I certainly don't want to deny you your unique story, or anyone. I'm just saying that, it's a perspective, that some, would, some psychologists would take. I wasn't putting that forth as if you are, so what do
But
you
I will
think?
get back to your AI question. I thought
Yeah.
that was interesting too, and I'm not going to try to put words in the author's mouth, but my own perspective on this was, this article to me gets to the point of the value of writing in a chat GPT world, where you can get artificial intelligence to write essays for you. And to me, this was precisely the value of thinking and writing for yourself. It's what I would answer if a former student of mine had asked, why do I have to write this essay when I can just get ChatGPT to write something for me in 3 seconds, and it's going to be all organized and grammatically correct? Because you are living your life, and thinking is part of how you navigate your own experience. And the act of writing is precisely how you think through what this life is and the meaning you're giving to it. And then, as human beings, we're both individual and social. So that the best thinking is both an internal process and a social process. And it's precisely by thinking in public and getting feedback when we are in the experimental stage that we get so much value.
What do you think, Chris?
Yeah, I guess I agree with Joy that this highlights the importance of doing your own work. I mean, I would say, maybe he didn't talk about AI because, it's kind of in the title, public speech. And maybe this is where we take the word speech a little more literally and say that the rise of AI will make speaking that much more important to your own thinking, because for better or for worse, most people probably are going to outsource more and more of their writing to AI. And so they may not get that experience of writing it out, or they may not be forced to, except in very controlled circumstances. And so on the one hand, I guess you could see that as a danger insofar as people writing is one of the primary ways they kind of think aloud. If they jettison that medium for thinking aloud, then it just narrows the other forums or mediums that they have available to kind of really determine what it is they think. I also think, speaking is kind of, for the most part, speaking is a public act. I think he was right to call it that. And so that is, as you noted, kind of more communal process. It's less individualized. And so I think one of the potential dangers also of AI, insofar as it does discourage people from writing, which is more of an individual private act, is that, it kind of puts more onus on you to kind of figure that out in front of other people. And I'm just not sure how that will play, given, especially in this current cultural climate where we're talking about how it's already so narrow what you can and can't say in public. I could foresee one scenario where the less people write, and the less hospitable it is to speak aloud in public with others, or the narrow range they have to speak, that just further kind of diminishes people's understanding of themselves. That would be, I guess, on the concern side, but I always like to see the pros and cons of new technology. And Joia looks like she wants to jump in, or were you going to say something, Joia? Oh
No,
sorry. Maybe she was pushing the baby. But on the other hand, I mean, certainly AI's capacity to help people access greater, more eloquent information and ways of saying things, to expand people's lexicon and vocabulary, kind of at will, and expose them to how to use words properly. I could see that being one of the beneficial byproducts of it, in that it helps give people, to what we're saying here, it helps give people the tools, or the words to express themselves as well. Even if they use AI as a first draft, but then overlay their own voice. I mean, we can debate, per your prior question, whether that then just takes them further away from their own voice, because it's literally a computer's voice that they're just laying onto, or whether it helps them. But I could make the case for both.
Of course, it's not a computer voice. I think one thing that people need to, so to get back to Joya's point of, the uniqueness of everyone's story, that, quite literally, Chat GPT and AI and stuff is only old stories. There is nothing. So because it's an algorithm, it's putting words together in ways that other people, that real live people, human people, have written into computers, or has been scanned in, historical texts and that kind of thing. So there literally is no new story, because it's not even like a new piece of music, or, like Joy said, a mathematical thing or anything, because it's only words that are most probabilistically linked together. And so it makes me sad. It makes me sad as someone who does research on language and the way that people use language. It's contaminating language research, because you would use, for example, like you're typing with your thumbs, you're texting, and you use a word that it suggests that maybe you wouldn't have used. It corrects your spelling in a way that you might have misspelled, or maybe you even have a pet name for someone, or you have a special word and it doesn't let you use that within your text. And so researchers who have been examining big data, like text messages and those kinds of instant messaging and stuff, they're finding that they're losing a lot. That the data is contaminated, and in ways that we can't really fully know. So it does make me sad, and because this article made me think about that a little bit, and more really, like what you were saying, Chris, making it more important, the free speech part. Of course, people are reading off their phones. That's a whole other thing.
Right.
What did you think? Were you moved at all by the section on metaphor? It's a short section. I don't know if you. Again, there's a whole psychological literature on metaphor, which I can share a little bit of if you want, but I'm interested in whether you were moved at all by the section on metaphor.
Yeah, do you mind teeing up the specific quote or passage you had?
He says, Wallace Stevens had this truth in mind. Let me go back.
The poem, right.
Yeah, but the first words out may be far from a completed thought, and this is our thought ever on the question of any profundity quite complete, and is our thought ever on a question of any profundity quite complete. Wallace Stevens had this truth in mind in his poem, The Motive for Metaphor, when he confessed an irrational fondness for the half colors of quarter things and so on. The obscure moon lighting in an obscure world. So he's using, where you yourself were never quite yourself, and did not want nor ever have to be. So this idea that using metaphor, using, as Joia mentioned, poetry, using metaphorical language. I was wondering if any of you were moved by that at all. I mean, one of the metaphors he actually uses speech as he says that sometimes it's a dream aloud experience. And that's a metaphorical approach, right? It's as if you're dreaming, it's practice for real life or rehearsal or whatever. And so he's using a metaphor in that section. So I just wondered if that, because it did it for me.
Yeah, well, and I think he's even...
Okay. Do you want to go first,
ahead.
Chris?
I was going to say, I think...
Oh, go ahead. You first. You go first, I'll go second.
Well, and I think he's kind of using metaphor and poetry somewhat synonymously here, right? Yeah, I would say I liked how he framed it. I didn't think of it in that way. I will say, just as an aside, I'm pretty good with a lot of concepts and language, but metaphors, I have a track record for mixing up and getting wrong. I've kind of self-diagnosed that I think it's because I have them all in my head and I'm like quickly split seconds filing through them to recall the right one. So for me, the experience of metaphor as kind of a half thought hits close to home.
Yeah.
And I think we need those I mean, insofar as if maybe what he's saying is these are kind of interim rhetorical devices that we use to kind of start out formulating our thoughts.
This is really typical, right? When you don't understand something, someone will say, well, it's like such and such, or is it like such and such, right? So they're using a simile or a metaphor in order to connect to yours telling a story. You've made an utterance of some sort, and they're trying to relate it to themselves or their own experience, perhaps using metaphor, right? Or you use metaphor in your effort to understand someone else, because as Joy said, we have unique experiences. In this common experience, within this common experience, we are having unique experiences and we're trying to connect with people, and metaphor is often, or simile is often the way that we do it, even if it's mixed up.
Yeah, thank you. Well, and I think I like how you said that it's kind of a bridge to understanding or relating kind of our unique perspective and story to others. So in that sense, it's further, I would say it's a great rhetorical and conceptual device. But yeah, I think it just, to me, I didn't really, I guess to directly answer your question, it didn't resonate super strongly with me, but I do see the benefit, especially now as we're teasing it out. To me, this just highlights again, kind of what I like about his theme of speech as experiment as well, kind of mental and rhetorical experiment, because I think if you start with poetry or metaphor, which is like a half dream or a dream thought, I think that is an important part of the process that people should feel comfortable and free to express as a means of understanding themselves and what it is they want to say with others. Because I think, again, there's just so much pressure and or fear about not saying the right thing in the right context in our current culture, that I think we just miss so much of the beauty and the individuality of people's unique perspectives, even if they are half formed and incomplete.
So what were you going to say, Joia?
So I was going to say the section on metaphor definitely resonated with me, because I thought it was a beautiful poetic way to capture the experience of what it is to try to put something in words and to try to put something into unique language. And I hear your point of how you're saddened by what's happening with artificial intelligence and what it's doing for language. But the way I see it is, when it comes to technology, it's often the way that technology is used, and lots of times technology can be used in ways that are harmful and destructive, but there can be ways that it's used for positive things. So I'll share personally, I have found benefit in some chat GPT and AI intelligence to do things like quickly researching what have people thought about this. What is the status quo opinion about something? That ChatGPT is wonderful for that. But I think it's important to connect that with an idea that it's never a replacement for you. And just to tie it back to the importance of trying to put your experience into your own words. And I'll say, like, I argue with Grammarly every time I try to use that program, because I'm constantly trying I love to create words. I love to create hyphenated words. So if you ever start reading some of my prose, you'll find that I'm constantly creating language because I'm trying to capture something where there isn't yet a word for something that I'm trying to say. Or I will use language that's more obscure, or it's not quite the right term, but because to me it captures something, and that's an important part of the process. And I hope that other people find that other people go through the experience of trying to put something into words. And to the author's point here, to do that in public, where they can get feedback from other real humans, and then maybe also feedback from AI machines as well. And that perhaps even in the future, when we're going to assume these technologies become more dominant, when they start to feed off of themselves, so not just on what other people have thought, but what on other AI machines have generated themselves, that it's still the individual human who ideally is standing on top of that and using that as a tool, using that as a resource. One way I love to think about the English language is that I've built up a toolbox of vocabulary, and so that it's not that I'm somehow submissive to the English language, but that the English language is there to serve me first and foremost, to give me a way to express what it is that I'm experiencing, feeling, thinking, and then to be able to share that with others as well. And then I hope other people will take that perspective on language, on writing, and on thinking aloud in public.
So one of the reasons why I love metaphor, I think that we use metaphor all the time because we're trying to figure, it's like, oh, well, is that like, well, I think, someone will say, well, oh, that happened to me. And you're thinking like, no, that is not anything like what I was just telling you, but they're doing the best that they can, to understand. But also there's this really rich history of metaphor in communication. And so I'm just going to use an example of cancer. So if people learn that they have cancer, and the metaphor that's used is a journey. So a journey, so your caregivers and such will be traveling this, engaging in this journey with you. Your family will be on this journey of cancer. People cope better emotionally and behaviorally than if you describe it as a fight. So we are going to fight this cancer. We are here to fight. Why? Because when people don't feel well on a day, or they are unable to eat, vomiting, whatever from chemo, they feel like they're losing the fight, right? Or let's face it, part of the journey may be making decisions that involve end of life, right? And if you're in a fight, you don't feel free to have that discussion, because someone has already framed this as a fight. And so we aren't allowed, there are things we're not allowed to discuss. And that made me think of free speech and everything also, because if we are fighting, for free speech, then we're in a fight, right? And we can't, anytime something doesn't go well, we failed, or we can't talk about what to do next because we're busy fighting. If we're on a journey, then then we're we are free to make alternative plans and to feel what we feel when we feel it. And that means everyone who's on the journey with us. It's not just the cancer person who's fighting, right? Mm-hmm. Which is how the fight ends up. It's like, well, they're the one with the cancer, so they're the one fighting. They're the one that's letting everyone down if they're not, right? So if if we're on this, journey together, and if we think about free speech, again, sort of historically across time, we are in a part of the journey that is, a low point, perhaps, or certainly a different trajectory. The river has, sort of changed trajectory or whatever. And so this is part of a journey that we need to travel together and help each other out on. So yeah, anyway, there's a whole, again, a whole psychological literature around metaphor. And that's just one example, but again, that section resonated with me for that reason. And, the whole, I think, well, I was just going to say, I think we actually talked about this on your podcast, but the other section that I marked was the part about, the radical and self-formative power of hearing oneself say no. In this section, often for reasons one could hardly explain initially, seems elemental in our moral nature. And one of the things that made me think about, so it's talking about, not knowing, they're talking about the arguments, not knowing that we oppose something until we are free to say, until somebody speaks something to us and we say no, we are opposed to it. And I'm kind of like, from a psychological perspective, I'm like, this is sort of the same thing that we talked about on your podcast, where it's like, I don't know, I don't have an opinion on everything. I don't care about everything. I certainly don't. If we thought about everything that we were going to interact with every day in life, we would be frozen, right? We would be completely unable to navigate the world. Mm-hmm. And so this section didn't really do it for me, because I'm like, I think that the world maybe is asking too much in the world where we're supposed to make statements about everything, right? This idea that we have to know what we think about stuff. I think we should be, this is my bias, but I think we should be saying, I don't know, a lot more often. I'm not sure. Tell me more. Or whatever, as opposed to, he's talking here about, like, saying no to something and not realizing you're opposed to something until you hear it out loud. I agree with that to some extent, but I also think that it was a little bit forced, because I research would suggest that the vast majority of things we interact with in life, we have given no thought to. And that first no, or that first yes, or whatever, is not really indicative of some, I don't know, like latent attitude. It's actually formed on the spot. I don't know. Maybe I'm missing something in that section, but that's what most research would show, is that we know almost nothing about most things and haven't given it any thought, and we really don't have an attitude about it. And the fact that we create one on the spot is not indicative of something deeper. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, that's interesting way of thinking about it. I agree. I at least agree that this section didn't really land with me either. I guess thinking aloud now as we talk through it, I took it more as he was using it as another example to demonstrate kind of his broader thesis that we start in a kind of formative pre-conceptual state, and these are different ways in which we kind of travel the journey, you might say, of forming our full thoughts and who we are. And so I guess maybe he's trying to say that, kind of how you even learn about your values and what you value and morality kind of often starts with a negative of what you react against or what you are not for, and that can be a clue, just like speaking aloud can be. And especially when you say the word no to someone else in a setting, that helps you kind of figure something out about yourself. So maybe while you're probably onto something with the point that none of us really know or has thought about most things that we encounter in the world, maybe that's what he's saying, is that when you say no, that's actually a
An
radical
opportunity.
exact a radical act of identification, and understanding, even integration about yourself that you can build off of.
Yeah. And I guess,
wait, can I just jump in really quick?
Yeah.
And I am going to have to go in about 5 minutes myself, but
Yeah.
I did want to just comment this, and you can finish with Chris. But I took this, even to bring it back to a metaphor. To me, this was the archetype of the teenager. So I agree wholeheartedly with you that in many instances, more people should be saying, I don't know, about more things. But in the process of going from I don't know to what you do know, or to what you will stand for, or who you will be to determine your identity, the archetype of the teenager, this is the stage of life, or the stage of, let's say, a thought process where you are becoming an individual. And what we know about teenagers is that the first way to do that is to rebel. Perhaps the first way to figure out what you do think about something is to say, well, it's not this. Like, I don't know what the answer is yet, but I know it's not this. And that is a useful first step. And then what I took his point to be is that we should allow people to say that without placing lots of other things on their no. So, for example, someone might have no idea what politics should be, but they can say no to Trump, no to Biden, no to Trump and Biden. You don't perhaps have an answer, but you can at least say it's not this. And saying it's not this is perhaps at least the first step to what you will say you will be for. And not loading that no with lots of other associations.
Right. So I was going to say, I know that you're trying to go, but they really sort of, he wraps this up. He says, the sense, he talks about in the last paragraph or so, the sense of speech as play. And I was thinking, for me, that's the meaning of being an academic, that all of this, I had envisioned myself as having, these kinds of conversations that we're having right now in the hallways, in classrooms, in research labs with research students and that kind of stuff. And certainly for the many years of my teaching experience, my time in academia, it was like that. But it isn't. Speech is not play now on campus. So, yeah, I guess I'll just, if you want to say a last few words about speech as play, or anything else that you wish that I would have asked about this article that you chose.
I would love to leave it as speech as play, because I think that even it captures the spirit of what we would hope for society, something that unfortunately we're not seeing now. And I will take the lesson that I think we learned here, that perhaps it's useful to describe what we are doing with free speech, not as a fight, but as a journey that we can invite more people on.
Yeah.
And maybe hopefully people will hear this message and will start to hear the value of speech as play and want more of that and be attracted to free speech just for that reason.
Yeah, and I would just echo that and say, to tie it back to the psychological angle here, psychologically, even I think thinking of speech as play almost kind of toning down all the expectations and the seriousness of it, particularly in a public context of talking with others, is a great way to reframe, again, what we mean by speech and the importance of free speech. And hopefully the more people reframe it that way, it can encourage more people to experiment through thinking aloud, and not have all the judgment or expectations or, not standards, but, kind of, requirements, requirements, constraints, what have you, around speech. And like I said earlier, no matter the domain, it doesn't have to be, and isn't primarily just political or intellectual matters, but even in kind of everyday working or relational life.
Creating the stories of our lives, right?
Yeah, exactly. So I thought that was a great way for him to kind of reinforce the fundamental thesis of thinking aloud as experimenting, and kind of how we get to the truth of a matter, which is, of course, the whole reason why we need free speech and why we want a liberal society that encourages each unique individual to tell their story and to play with it.
Well, thank you both so much. Thank you for sharing this article with me and for discussing it with me. I appreciate it very much.
Yeah, thank you for going through it with us in a deep dive. That was a fascinating and great conversation.